Greetings friends and welcome to the story of the world that was. I'm Lorcan and this is Only War. In the first episode we travelled all the way back to the dawn of creation, before even the time of the Old Ones, and ended our journey with the betrayal of Malekith that would lead to the Elven Civil War, fracturing the Elven race and leaving much of northern Ulthuan itself a devastated ruin. Countless thousands perished in the tsunami that crashed down on Nagash and neighbouring Tiranoc when Malekith the Witch King had his last desperate bid for victory, attempting to unbind the magic of the Great Vortex, thwarted by Calador Dragon Tamer and the other trapped mages who had enacted the great ritual that led to its initial creation. Using the last of their magical power, the Witch King's sorcerers enchanted the very citadels of Nagash, imbuing them with dark power and allowing them to break free of their rocky perches and float upon the turbulent sea now engulfing Malekith's kingdom. Aboard these floating bastions that would later become known as the Black Arks, the Witch King, his mother Marathi and their remaining allies fled first north across the Great Ocean, and then westwards for many weeks through first the Sea of Chill and then further across the Sea of Malice, until eventually landing on the bleak, frigid shores of the western continent they would name Nagaroth after their former home, now all but lost beneath the churning sea. Here on the far western shores of the Sea of Malice, under the shadow of the Iron Mountains, the Black Ark that was once the citadel of Malekith would fuse with the foothills that lined the desolate shore. Here they would establish their new kingdom, enslaving tribes of primitive humans and beginning what they would call the Age of Restless Spite. Around this same time, 2,700 years before the crowning of Sigmar, two very different races would also find their permanent homes in the old world. The Ogres had defeated and consumed the Sky Titans, but debris thrown out from the coming of the Great Maw would still be carried on the winds and fall heavily on the mighty peaks of the ancient giant lands. Instinctively, the majority of the Ogres knew they must move on, with only a few choosing to stay in their newly won territory. Those that did remain would evolve shaggy white hair and long talons, becoming the bestial Yeti, but the rest would push further west into the range known as the Mountains of Mourn. Here, sheltered somewhat from the mutating effects of the particulate matter thrown out by the Maw, they found rich hunting grounds amidst the craggy valley floors. Soon the Ogres would seize total control over their new home, and it would become known as the Ogre Kingdoms. To the west of the Mountains of Mourn, the long-lost dwarf kindreds that had been cut off in the tides of chaos had continued their fall to darkness with their pact with Hashut. Across the barren but mineral-rich dark lands their empire had spread, and twisted by the influence of chaos, the corrupted dwarfs had even embraced the use of magic, alongside their traditional affinity for mechanical invention. Using arcane machinery and potent spells, the Chaos Dwarfs raised the Tower of Zar Nagrund, the lone mighty city in all of their empire, the city of fire and desolation dominating the plain of Zar. Fashioned from obsidian, the gargantuan city rose, tier upon tier, each hundreds of feet high, like a ziggurat above the myriad of diabolical furnaces, serviced by untold numbers of enslaved orcs and goblins, smelting the metals needed for their arcane devices. Some say the city was raised by the Chaos Dwarf sorcerers in a single night, but what is certain is that at the pinnacle stands the Temple of Hashut, the Father of Darkness, and from here the sorcerers would rule as lords and masters of the Chaos Dwarfs and their legion of slaves. We are still 2,500 years before the birth of Sigmar, and until this point the race of man had been little more than tribes of nomadic barbarians, of little consequence to the powerful civilization of elves and dwarves, and mere prey to the twisted creatures that inhabited the dark forests. But the first great empire of men was about to rise far to the south of the greenskin-infested Badlands. Along the fertile banks of the Vitae River, previously nomadic tribes formed permanent settlements that grew in time to be great cities of white stone and carved marble. They constructed roads, and fleets of elegant ships carried trade goods between the neighbouring cities. Each was governed by their own king, who raised their own armies to subdue any rival tribes and repulse invading greenskin hordes that sought to slaughter their subjects and pillage their holdings. These city kingdoms became united as what would become known as Nejikada, the Great Land, and the greatest of all these cities was Khemri, the City of Kings. And while each city was ruled mostly autonomously, each was also expected to show loyalty and pay tribute to the might of Khemri. Together they drove hostile elements from their lands, and at the zenith of its power, Nejikada had expanded from the western deserts of Arabe east to the Sea of Dread, and from the lands that would one day be the southern provinces of the Empire in the north to the jungles of the Southlands. Though Nejikada prospered and its cities grew in wealth and influence, the men of these distant times were no different to the men of today, and they lusted for ever greater power. To this end, disputes between neighbours became wars, and rulership of the great land was passed via conquest from king to king, as none who held the crown had the true strength to hold power for long. The unremitting civil wars of the time of strife took their toll, and when drought and plague also took hold across Nejikada, the greenskin hordes and tribes of northern barbarians were too often left unchecked to rampage through the once mighty kingdoms, as each king was too proud, arrogant, and distrustful to form lasting alliances. The first great civilization of man stood on the brink of destruction. The priests of Nejikada warned the ancient gods had been angered, but their protestations fell on deaf ears. But one king heard their dire portents. He was a vain and egotistical man, known for his cruelty and arrogance. He was the newly crowned King SETTRA of Khemri, who demanded not only obedience from his subjects, but outright veneration. For all his personal flaws, SETTRA was no fool, and he listened to the old priests, realizing that if he could command the respect of the gods, he would gain the adulation of the people, and his hold over Nejikada would be absolute. First, he restored the temples and erected monuments to honor the ancient desert gods. On the first anniversary of his coronation, he sacrificed his own children in a grand ritual and beseeched the gods to give him the power to conquer his rival kings and restore Khemri to its former glory. The gods appeared to answer his call. The great Vitae River flooded for the first time in decades, cleansing Khemri of disease and providing a bountiful harvest to feed its army and people. Thus SETTRA became the first priest king of Khemri, favoured by the gods and with the unswerving loyalty of a rejuvenated people. SETTRA was a mighty warlord with a keen tactical mind, complemented by formidable martial prowess. Leading his legions from the front, one by one the great cities of Nejikada were brought to heel, and no mercy was shown to those who opposed his right to rule. All were conquered and forced to swear fealty to the rule of SETTRA and the preeminence of Khemri once more. Though SETTRA was undoubtedly a ruthless tyrant, under his rule Nejikada prospered once more, and grand monuments were raised not only to the ancient pantheon of the desert gods, but also to SETTRA himself, as even far distant lands quaked at the reach and power of the priest king's armies. However, as SETTRA reached the 40th year of his reign, and his body began to show the first signs of inevitable decline and frailty of old age, he realized that not only would his dream of global conquest be thwarted by his mortality, but worse, he would be robbed of all he had already achieved. Rage gave way to obsession, and gathering together the wisest of his priests and scholars, he founded the Mortuary Cult with the purpose of unlocking everlasting life. Through potions and incantations they extended his life and their own to unnatural lengths. The Hierophants began to harness the winds of magic, but for all their progress and increasing knowledge of death, the secret of immortality eluded them. They promised SETTRA that in time they may well be able to perfect the rituals and incantations that would allow him to cross back from the realm of souls into an imperishable body to rule once more. With a curse on his lips, the mortal life of SETTRA would end in 2350 before the rise of Sigmar. His body was interned within a majestic pyramid of shining white stone in the heart of Khemri, along with his most loyal servants and soldiers, to await the day of reckoning. Back in frigid Nagash, the race now known as the Dark Elves, or the Druchii in their tongue, under the rule of Malekith, had not been idle. Both they and their hated kin, now known as the Azur or High Elves, had been forced to nurse the wounds of the Sundering, and neither had the strength to launch a full-scale assault on the other. The Dark Elves continued to establish new cities in Nagaroth, and Morathi would form the Convent of Sorceresses and begin the construction of the Citadel of Grond, as their slaver ships travelled east on ever more frequent raids to bring the slave labour needed for these endeavours. On Ulthuan, Calador would oversee the construction of the fortresses at Griffin Gate, Phoenix Gate, Eagle Gate, Dragon Gate and Unicorn Gate, to protect the inner kingdoms from invasion. Centuries of naval warfare and skirmishes would ensue between the Druchii and the Azur, as Malekith sought to gain a foothold in northern Ulthuan once more, and the Blighted Isles, where Widowmaker still rested, was frequently taken and reclaimed by both sides. Eventually Calador personally led an expedition to take the Blighted Isle, and stood before the altar of Cain as Anarion once did. The blade called to him, and he stood for some time in silent contemplation, until finally he uttered one word: no. However, on his return voyage to Lothern, Morathi called down a storm that scattered his fleet, and Calador's ship was blown far off course, and he was isolated from his forces. Guided by further dark sorcery, the Phoenix King's flagship was soon located and boarded by Malekith's pirates. Calador and his loyal crew fought bravely, but their fate was inevitable. Refusing to be taken prisoner by the Witch King, Calador the Conqueror leapt from his ship, clad in full armour, and sank beneath the waves. A bad end for a truly great king. The High Elven people were desperate for stability following Calador's passing, and seeking continuality, the Council of Princes chose his son to succeed him in 2198 before the birth of Sigmar. Alas, Calador II, known as the Warrior, would prove to be a rash and impetuous Phoenix King, and his reign would in time bring great pain and loss to the Azur. The High Elves would start to return to the old world in greater numbers following the coronation of Calador II. Trading once again resumed between the Azur and the Karaz Angkor, but in the centuries that had passed, much had changed in the lands around their far-flung colonies. Malekith saw an opportunity with the rash Calador now leading the Azur, and with his deep knowledge of the dwarf realm and culture, he hatched a plan over the coming centuries that would bring great woe on both races. The Dark Elves had again focused their attention inwards in the centuries following the death of Calador I. The pleasure cults were again growing in popularity, and none more so than those of Cain, Lord of Murder. As bloodthirsty mobs ran rampant through Nagash, Malekith embraced the madness and bloodlust of the cult, and proclaimed himself the mortal incarnation of Cain as cultists flocked to his banner. Despite Caledor II's many flaws, the High Elf colonies were prospering, and tides of trade and even friendship with the dwarves were growing stronger. Fearing an alliance between the two races which would spell doom for the Druchii, Malekith put his plan into motion. Rumours of the Elven Civil War had reached the ears of the dwarves, but the tales of kin-slaying and treachery were such alien concepts to them that they dismissed most of them out of hand. For their part, the proud and haughty elves did not share the truth with their allies either. Malekith unleashed his agents, and using knowledge of secret trade routes he had gained during his time as Bel-Shanar's trusted ambassador to the Karaz Kor, his raiders wrought great havoc on the trading caravans of the dwarves, planting evidence to lead suspicion to the colonies of the Azur. Merchants were slaughtered alongside their stout caravan guards. A delegation travelling from Karak Zorn in the Southlands was ambushed south of Karak Azul, and settlements destroyed, most notably Zakbar Varf. Plunder flowed back to Nagash as the Azur took the blame for the atrocities, and the two ancient races would teeter on the brink of war. The once primitive race of man was undergoing rapid societal change across the globe, with permanent settlements becoming more common, but Nejikada remained the most advanced. Following the death of SETTRA, many dynasties rose and fell, but no single priest king could replicate SETTRA's iron grip on the entirety of Nejikada. Although they did not descend into all-out civil war that preceded the first priest king's rule, in the centuries-long era known as the Time of Kings, the borders of each territory were constantly shifting, determined only by the current strength of arms, driving each king to raise vast legions. The priest kings fought many battles against the surrounding tribes of greenskins and barbaric humans from the north and west. Their disciplined legions and skilled charioteers rightly feared. They plundered gold from the southern dwarves and jewels from the temple cities of the reptilian lizard men. Trains of slaves carried this wealth back to their kingdoms, but nearly the entirety was spent raising larger armies and the construction of ever more extravagant tombs. The priest kings all shared SETTRA's ambition to defy death and rule for all eternity, so the Mortuary Cult continued to grow in power and influence. The generation of priests that SETTRA gathered passed on their rudimentary knowledge to the next, who built further on their teachings. By the 5th generation, the priests had been able to bind their souls to their bodies, preventing their own deaths, and the incantations to awaken the long-dead kings were seemingly soon to be within their grasp. But the clergy members, now known as the Lich Priests, faced a quandary. They had gained unprecedented power, and their influence was second only to the ruling kings themselves. Their secrets were closely guarded to maintain the status quo, and with their eternal lives they watched the dynasties rise and fall. The Mortuary Cult oversaw a Nejikaran society that became obsessed with death, a cultural shift that changed the architecture and landscape of the Great Land forever. Priest kings demanded larger and more elaborate monuments, and pyramids in which to be entombed, although none would dare exceed the majesty of SETTRA's Great Pyramid. Their loyal servants and greatest warriors hoped to share in this eternal life, and soon the necropolises of tombs and monuments dwarfed the humble dwellings of the living that toiled ceaselessly in their construction and maintenance. But 2,000 years before the rise of Sigmar, a child would be born who would rise up and bring the majesty of Nejikaran society to its knees. Back in the old world, and tensions between the High Elves and the Dwarfs brought about by Malekith's scheming were about to reach breaking point.
Heed well, stubble-chinned beardlings, while I tell you the tale of the greatest treachery, the most base treason to be inflicted upon us. It was the reign of Gotrek Starbreaker 4,500 years ago, when our empire spread across the world and even the poorest dwarf had a bag of gold the size of your head. At that time, the peoples of the Elf Kingdoms and the sons of Grungni lived in peace with one another. Trade flowed across the world and our coffers filled with well-earned elf gold, as the kin of Ulthuan scrambled to own the labours of our magnificent artisans, whose apprenticeship work surpassed that of today's greatest smiths. But then the capricious and faithless folk of Ulthuan, dishonourable to an elf, were overcome by greed for our lands and possessions. In an act of betrayal never again equalled, they ambushed our convoys, slew our warriors and maidens, and stole our finely crafted goods. But Gotrek Starbreaker, being a king of whom it said wore wisdom and age easily upon his brow, stayed his hand and sent messengers and envoys to the shores of the Elf Isle to parley with the folk of distant Ulthuan.
A note here, dear friends. The War of the Beard as it is known to the Elves, or the War of Vengeance as it is known to the Dwarfs, will be discussed in greater depth in a future video, but in this series we will only cover the main events. To make sure you hear that tale, strike a grudge from the great book by smiting the like and subscribe buttons before we continue. While Caledor II was a rash and impetuous Phoenix King, the Karazhan Khor were under the rule of High King Gotrek Starbreaker, and when word reached him of the attacks on the trading caravans, he would not act impulsively despite the outrage of some of his thanes. The elves and dwarves had prospered to the benefit of both races, and he would not throw away such ties on what could be a misunderstanding. Ambassadors from the elven court in the Old World, of which Prince Imladric, brother of King Caledor, was the highest ranking noble, had assured the dwarfs that these were isolated acts of malice to try and undermine peace. For his part, Imladric admired the Dawi, seeing them as a noble race who valued heritage, tradition and honour. He believed despite their differences there was much the two races could still learn from each other. But when the ancient rune lord Angrin Fireheart was slain in one of the Druchii ambushes, relations between the Azur and the Dawi soured very quickly. Despite Prince Imladric discovering the involvement of the Dark Elves and sending word to the High King, Gotrek still ended trade with the Azur and closed his borders. Imladric would return to Ulthuan to implore King Caledor to act and seek peace for the protection of their colonies on the Old World. But Caledor II, convinced of the superiority of the Azur over all races, dismissed his concerns. In the 8 years that would follow, acts of aggression between elf and dwarf would continue, without all-out war being declared. Despite High King Gotrek's reluctance to go to war, his son Prince Snorri Halfhand would muster a throng, and after garrisoning them at Blackfire Pass, his patience finally broke when he received word that Dawi maidens and priestesses were among the recent dead. Snorri would march on the Azur settlement of Khor Vaneath with nearly 40,000 of his kinsmen and leave it in ruins before turning their attention to Tor Alessi, now present-day Langile, in Bretonnia, greatest of the Azur colonies. With the grudges mounting, and along with them pressure on High King Gotrek to drive the Azur from the Old World, he sent his most skilled ambassador, Forek Grimbok, with a missive to take to the Phoenix King in Ulthuan. While Gotrek expected an apology for the transgressions done to his people, he still hoped the peace between the two races could be salvaged. Some tales say that King Kallador rejected an earlier offer to disavow the actions of the elves in the old world, or offer compensation he was asked for, and that he insulted the High King by telling him to plead for assistance with his troubles, and was unconcerned by the threats he made. What is known, however, is that on the morning the delegation from Karaz-a-Karak arrived in his court, word of the sacking of Corvaneath reached the Phoenix King. Even accepting the delegation and their High King knew nothing of the attack that Prince Snorri had instigated, did not temper Kallador's rage and the impulsiveness of his next action. Knowing full well the dire insult his callous actions would cause, Kallador ordered his guards to shave the beards from Forek and his party before casting them from his court in shame. On completing his duty to the High King, the ambassador would take the Slayer oath for the indignity placed upon him. Gotrek would not tolerate this final, most grievous insult, and now truly enraged ordered the Thanes of each stronghold to muster their throngs, and declared war on the Azur and their arrogant Phoenix King. The War of Vengeance had begun. Dowie throngs drawn from across their realm marched on the elven colonies in the old world, destroying them swiftly. Prince Snorri had agreed to wait for 7 days for the army of the High King to arrive and join his force before attacking Tor Alessi. But when these days passed, the impetuous prince marched with his 30,000 remaining troops. They would reach sight of Tor Alessi unimpeded, but what they found there was an Azur war host whose numbers far exceeded their expectations. The battle in front of the walls was fiercely fought on both sides, and Prince Snorri had to commit all his forces, including a reckless charge from Snorri himself deep into Azur lines, to push the elves into retreat. But despite the might of the Dowie army, they found breaching the walls immediately beyond their means, and they were forced to lay siege. The throng led personally by the High King would soon join in besieging the city, and for 14 days the combined forces of Gotrek, Prince Snorri and the Thanes attacked the outer walls, breaching them in several places, but unable to reach the inner sections of the citadel. At last, word came that a massive fleet of Azur ships were approaching. The arrival of the elven host caused the dwarves to retreat from the walls of Tor Alessi, but both sides would soon find that the war in the old world would be a drawn-out affair, as neither side had the strength to overcome the other. The elves found the major dwarf holds to be nearly impenetrable fortresses, and the stalwart dwarves that manned them simply refused to admit defeat, however dire their situation may be. Upon hearing of the dwarf attack on Tor Alessi, Kallador had been outraged, and made preparations immediately to dispatch his mighty fleet, carrying much of the military strength of Ulthuan to break the siege. His advisors warned against leaving their homeland so weakened, worrying that should an assault come on Ulthuan, they would not have the forces needed to defend their shores. Kallador impetuously dismissed their fears. The dwarves, for their part, had found they had vastly underestimated the true might of Ulthuan's forces. Judging them by the weakest of their provincial colonies, they had not been prepared for the huge armies of disciplined infantry and the martial prowess of their knights. But in true dwarf fashion, they were not about to admit their error. The war ground on bitterly for 20 years, until in 1974 before Sigmar, word came to the Great Hall in Karaz-a-Karak that the Phoenix King Kallador II had finally been drawn onto the field of battle personally and was at Angaz Barak Dum. To High King Gotrek's dismay, Prince Snorri had also received this information, and having returned to garrison Blackfire Pass rather than returning with his father to the Everpeak, he was already marching out, determined to meet Kallador's army and end the war. However, before the battle would commence, King Kallador rode out to parley with Prince Snorri. A discussion between the arrogant and sneering Kallador and the hot-headed and rash Snorri was only ever going to end one way, and the prince challenged the Phoenix King to single combat. It is not known if Snorri intended both sides to withdraw honourably at the conclusion of their duel, but Kallador had no such intention. What was soon to become clear was that for his many other faults, the Phoenix King was one of the most fearsome warriors of the age. When Prince Snorri spoke the words of grudgment, King Kallador mocked the dwarf prince, easily provoking his rage, before striking a blow that Dowie Tales would always claim broke the honour of single combat. Snorri would never recover from these first exchanges, but truth be told, he was never a match for Kallador, who pressed home his advantage, and having struck a mortal blow, proceeded to sever Snorri's arm at the elbow, and cast it into one of the water-filled quarries that made up Angaz Barakdum. In dwarven belief, this would leave Snorri without a means to heft his axe, and forever a cripple in the afterlife. Despite their plans to engage the Dowie once the duel was concluded, the fury of the dwarf attack having seen their prince cut down made Kallador and his forces retreat back to their ships, and the Dowie to take Snorri's body on the long journey back to Karaz-a-Karak. The grief at the loss of his son would drive the High King into a blackest of rages. He vowed to level the full might of the Karaz-Ankur on the Azur and their arrogant king, but it would be centuries yet until this grudge could be struck from the Great Book and his oath of vengeance satisfied. Back in Nejikada, the child who was born some 30 years prior was about to start his ascent to power. The firstborn son of King Katep of Khemri was destined, as was tradition, to serve in the Mortuary Cult, while his younger brother Tutep was heir to his father's throne. But Nagash, as that was his name, had other plans. Nagash was an exceptional student and quickly rose through both heritage and talent to become one of Khemri's high priests. But despite the high standing his position afforded, it would not sate his desire for power. He coveted the throne his aging father would leave to Tutep, and began to corrupt the Mortuary Cult itself, drawing to him like-minded acolytes. In 1968, before the coming of Sigmar, either by luck or foul design, a Dark Elf vessel would be shipwrecked on the coast of Nejikada. The Druchii included in their number a warlock and 2 sorceresses, and having been taken prisoner by Xandrian forces, they were later presented as slaves to serve Nagash's recently deceased father, King Katep, in the afterlife. Katep was killed in a conflict with the priest king of Xandri, using sorcery of an unknown origin to Nagash at this point. Nagash took possession of the Dark Elves, and over the course of 2 years' imprisonment in the Great Pyramid of Katep, they divulged the secrets of the use of Dar, the essence of dark magic. Nagash proved his prodigious talent once more, quickly mastering all they could teach him, recording every detail in great tomes. The Druchii told him the winds of magic blew weakly in the desert, but Nagash's knowledge grew further as he continued his studies with his captured tutors for a further 3 years, learning the incantation of reaping to separate the living spirit from the body and draw it into himself. The Dark Elves hoped that Nagash would be reckless in his pursuit of more power, believing he could not master their more potent spells with only the power of these stolen souls. But they had not counted on Nagash's years in the Mortuary Cult, and his ability to adapt and combine the Nejikada incantations with their dark arts. Nagash would also draw to him members of the slighted nobility from across Khemri, who questioned the methods of his brother's rule, and perceived Khemrian, and therefore their own power, diminished by his actions. Amongst them was a young noble whose excesses had left him with ruined teeth, known as Arkan the Black. 3 more years would pass, and Nagash's promises to Arkan and his fellow conspirators would be proven true, as they gained in power and wealth. This had come about as a plague descended on the noble houses of Khemri, a sickness that dissolved its victims from the inside out, and only those loyal to Nagash seemed immune to its ravages, and rumours spread it was a punishment of the gods and the fault of Tutep. Meanwhile, Nagash deemed that he had surpassed his captured Druki teachers, and with their usefulness expended, Nagash would confront all three in a deadly magical duel, during which he would display his true grasp of the dark arts and slew them all. The next night he summoned his followers, many of which he had started to train in his forbidden knowledge, to enact a powerful ritual, sacrificing dozens of slaves and vagrants for their life energy to power his curse. However, Nagash and his allies would be interrupted by King Tutep and his Ashapti bodyguard, and in the vicious fight that would follow, Nagash, aided by Arkan and the other conspiring noblemen, would eventually overcome the martially superior Blessed of Petra through their mastery of dark magics. When the last of King Tutep's bodyguard was slain, Nagash would take pleasure in exerting his prodigious will on his brother before ordering him entombed, still alive, within the tomb prepared for him within the pyramid of their father. With this treasonous act against his own king, Nagash seized the throne, and none were left within Khemri who dared oppose him. While Nejikada was still the main centre of true human civilization, there have been developments elsewhere in the world. According to Chilean legend, around the same time as Nagash was rising to power, a minor dwarf clan from the Black Mountains began trade with a human settlement known as Tylos. The dwarves would take up residence in tunnels beneath the city, and both would prosper from this alliance. Tylos, or Kavzad as the dwarfs knew it, would rise in advance of other human settlements of the time. With the aid of the dwarves, the humans would learn of architecture and within 70 years to praise their gods for their good fortune and prosperity, they began the construction of a great temple that would go on for 100 years. As the humans attempted to complete the magnificent spire of the temple, work slowed to a crawl with the difficulty of transporting stone to such a height. Just as the humans despaired the work would never be completed, a grey-clad stranger came to them. He offered to complete the temple in a single night, and all he asked for his aid was to add his own dedication to the gods onto the temple structure. Eager to see their labours completed, the townsfolk accepted the stranger's bargain, and he entered the temple at dusk, bidding them to return at midnight. Obscured by dark clouds and the veil of night, the top of the spire was not revealed until midnight, and the men gazed on the finished spire and the stranger's dedication. A great bell hung there gleaming in the moonlight, but of the mysterious figure there was no sign. The bell would toll 13 times, growing louder with each stroke until the gathered men could not stand its sound. At the last stroke, lightning split the sky, illuminating the dark circle of the cursed moon Morsleb above. Darkness greeted them the next morning, and then a great storm brought torrential rain that was black and oily. The temple doors were sealed shut, and days stretched to months, but the rains did not cease. The men sought aid of the dwarves, but they were unconcerned by such matters. The rains turned to dark hailstones that crushed their crops, followed by meteorites of warpstone that not only smashed their homes, but twisted and perverted the very architecture of the city itself, from its once glorious past into a nightmarish cyclopean maze. Sickness and death followed for both human and dwarf, as children were born twisted and deformed, tunnels flooded, and swarms of vermin devoured what little stores of food remained. The humans even turned their prayers toward the dark and forbidden gods of chaos, but all that came were more vermin. Now much larger and more fierce, they took to devouring not only the dead, but dragging down the living, until finally nothing but vermin remained in the cursed city. The Skaven race were born in merciless slaughter. Tylos was no more, and Skaven blight would rise from its gnawed-out husk. In the far east, the ruling dragon emperor united the entire land of Cathay into a single empire 1,800 years before the coming of Sigmar. To protect his lands from the savage tribes of Kurgan coming from the wastes, he ordered the construction of the Great Bastion along the northern border of his empire. Despite the massive scale of this task, it is believed the fortified wall is completed within 100 years. Having usurped his brother, Nagash delved deeper into the forbidden magics, combining his skills in dark magic with his knowledge of death from the Mortuary Cult to become a master of necromancy. He committed his findings to many books, including the 9 tomes that would become the most powerful source of necromantic power in the world, the Books of Nagash. Having learnt to leech the vitality from living blood in the year 1950 before the birth of Sigmar, Nagash ordered the construction of the Black Pyramid. When it was completed, it would dwarf every other structure in Nejikada. An army of slaves was required for the task, but Nagash had these in abundance after his swift and brutal victory over the northern kingdoms of Zandri. Arkan was instrumental in this success, and became Nagash's chief vizier, and the first of his vassals to imbibe his life-giving elixir and enjoy the vigour of youth it brought. Given oversight of the construction of the pyramid, Arkan ensured the bodies of the slaves that perished during its construction were added to the pyramid's foundations and inner structure, further attuning it to Nagash's invocations. Nagash had imprisoned his brother's widow Nepharem, rather than allowing her to join her husband in death, and this breaking of tradition caused the hierophants of the living city to petition against the rule of one who some now called the Usurper. When Nagash slew Nepharem's son and tricked her into partaking in the elixir of life, he also broke the covenant between gods and men from the time of SETTRA. But for all his vast intellect, Nagash did not realize the power of the gods was now his to command in doing so. Nepharem was a conduit of the gods' power, and in corrupting her, he also cut off the priests of Nejikada from much of their power. Work on the Great Pyramid continued, draining Khemri of wealth and manpower despite the tithes initially sent from the other great cities. But as the years passed and Khemri's population dwindled, many of the other cities withdrew their ambassadors and reneged on their tithes. Nagash cared not. He and his chosen vassals had become ageless and powerful beyond mortal ken, but they paid a steep price for their gifts. The light of Nejikada's sun burned their skin and sapped their terrible strength, forcing them to seek refuge in the deepest cellars or crypts during the day. It was as though Petra, the sun god himself, opposed Nagash's will, scourging him and his immortals with fire. It took 2 centuries for the Black Pyramid to be completed, darker than the night, its edges knife-sharp against the indigo sky. Arcs of pale lightning would occasionally crawl across its polished surface. The pyramid was a collector and an attractor of dark magic, and for 200 years it had glutted itself on the spirits of tens of thousands of slaves. That energy coursed through its glossy stones, stored for a single purpose, a ritual unlike anything Nagash had ever performed. At the heart of the vast pyramid was a ritual chamber, a large octagonal room whose walls curved upwards to form a faceted dome above a complex ritual circle some 15 paces across, carved directly into the marble floor and inlaid with crushed onyx and silver. Thousands of complex hieroglyphs had been carved into the gleaming walls, each one painstakingly designed to focus the death energies stored within the pyramid and channel them into the ritual circle. The ritual Nagash planned was a means to cut off the power of the very gods themselves. He would ensure that the priests of Nejikada would die in a single stroke, starving the gods of the veneration of the people. He didn't fear breaking the ancient covenant with the gods that sustained Nejikada, because in his vision life and death would have no meaning, no fear of hunger or disease, an eternal empire, that would spread to dominate the whole world. But on the eve of the ritual, as Nagash rested in his marble sarcophagus, he found himself betrayed by one of his closest servants. A group of priests attempted to burn Nagash, and although they failed and fell to his dark magics, including his first animation of a corpse, he was affected greatly. The attempted coup made Nagash rush to complete his incantation. Drawing on the power of the newly completed Black Pyramid, he created a tempest of unnatural energy that then burst into an irresistible wave that spread like ripples of shadow across every corner of Nejikada in mere moments. Darkness fell across all the great cities, and every priest and acolyte touched by the shadow died in a single agonizing instant. However, in his rage, Nagash had only partially succeeded, and those priests shielded by stone survived his deathly shadow. He was forced to confront Nephirim and the high priests of the other major deities at SETTRA's court, where with the aid of Arkan and his other immortals, they slew the Hierophants, and Nagash drew Nephirim's soul slowly from her body, leaving her a withered parody of the great beauty he once desired with such passion, yet still clinging to life. The year is now 1750 before the coming of Sigmar, and due to Nagash's reign of terror, Nejikada was teetering on the precipice. The point where he would wage war not only on the remaining great cities, but on the very gods themselves, with the future of the great land, and possibly in time the whole world at stake. Thank you for joining me on our journey back to the world that was, and I hope I earned your subscription today. And I'll see you again in the near future, where there is only war.